It is not an overstatement to note that the barbaric institution of slavery is as old as mankind itself. It's a practice which existed in various forms across different cultures and continents the world over. From the empires of antiquity to the dawn of the modern era, slavery has been an embodiment of the social, economic, and political orders of almost all civilizations throughout the world. Understanding the origins and evolution of slavery is crucial to comprehending the complexities of human history and the enduring legacy of this brutal practice. Slavery, in its essence, is the systematic exploitation of one individual by another, stripping away their freedom and autonomy for economic gain or social control. While the specifics of slavery varied greatly across time and place, the underlying principle of forced labor and subjugation remained constant. Whether we examine the slave societies of ancient Mesopotamia, the Roman Empire, or pre-colonial Africa, we find common threads of power, domination, and the dehumanization of individuals for the benefit of the powerful few. The purpose of this exploration is not to minimize or justify the barbarism of slavery regardless of form, place, or time. Instead, it aims to explain and provide a broader historical context of the institution of slavery in African societies and shed light on the largely disregarded enslavement of black Africans by Arabs from the 7th century, long before Europeans stepped foot on African soil in the 15th century. In this chapter, we will delve into the origins and basic forms of slavery in Africa and the Arab world before the arrival of the Europeans, to project a deeper understanding of this complex and often overlooked chapter of history. By examining the roots of slavery in these communities and regions, we can gain a more nuanced understanding of the factors that contributed to the development of the horrific transatlantic slave trade. Furthermore, this historical context will illuminate the global nature of slavery, challenging the widespread misconception that it was solely a European phenomenon, airbrushing from history the enslavement and suffering of hundreds of millions of black Africans in the hands of fellow Africans and Arabs in the period before the transatlantic slave trade by Europeans.
Slavery existed in Africa long before the arrival of Arab traders or European colonizers. It was an integral part of many African societies, albeit with significant variations in its practice and impact. In some African cultures, slavery was primarily a consequence of warfare, with captured enemies forced into servitude. These individuals were often integrated into their captors' communities, and their offspring could eventually gain freedom. In other cases, slavery was used as a form of punishment for crimes or non-payment of debts. Individuals could be enslaved to work off their transgressions or financial obligations. This form of slavery often had a defined duration, with the possibility of regaining freedom after fulfilling the terms of servitude. However, it is crucial to note that even within these systems, the power dynamics inherent in slavery remained. Furthermore, the nature of slavery in Africa differed significantly from the chattel slavery that emerged in the Americas. African slavery was often less rigidly defined by race or ethnicity. Enslaved individuals could be integrated into their captors' kinship groups, and their offspring might not inherit their enslaved status. While this does not diminish the suffering of those enslaved, it highlights the diverse forms slavery took in pre-colonial Africa. It is important to avoid imposing modern conceptions of race and ethnicity onto historical African societies. The concept of a unified African identity as we understand it today is a relatively contemporary construct. Pre-colonial Africa was home to a vast tapestry of diverse cultures, languages, and social structures, each with its own unique relationship to slavery. Similar to Africa, slavery was not an alien concept in the Arab world prior to the arrival of Islam in the 7th century. Ancient civilizations in the Arabian Peninsula, such as the Sabaeans and Himyarites, practiced forms of slavery integrated into their social and economic structures. These early forms of slavery often involved individuals captured during tribal conflicts or those who had fallen into debt. The advent of Islam in the 7th century brought significant changes to the Arabian Peninsula, including its approach to slavery. While Islam did not abolish slavery nor prohibit the practice, it introduced regulations and guidelines for its practice. Islamic law forbade the enslavement of fellow Muslims, with limited exceptions. As a result, the emergence of Islam in the Arab world caused Arab traders to begin to look beyond the Arabian Peninsula for slaves. This exploration led to increased interactions with parts of Africa and the Byzantine Empire, both of which had established slave trading networks. The expansion of the Islamic empires through conquest and trade further fueled the demand for slaves. Enslaved people, both male and female, were integrated into various aspects of society, serving as soldiers, domestic workers, concubines and labourers in agriculture and mining. These early interactions between the Arab world and Africa laid the groundwork for the more extensive and brutal slave trade that would develop in the centuries to come. The Arab slave trade, a complex and tragic chapter in human history, spanned centuries and left an enduring impact on Africa, the Arab world and beyond. While the transatlantic slave trade is often at the forefront of discussions about slavery, it is crucial to recognize that the Arab slave trade, which involved the enslavement of millions of Africans, predated it by at least 700 years. This trade was not a monolithic entity, but rather a network of interconnected routes and practices that evolved over time. The rise of the Arab slave trade was intricately linked to the expansion of the Islamic empires and the growing demand for labor in various sectors of Arab society. As Islamic and Arab empires spread across North Africa and the Middle East, these created a need for workers in agriculture, mining, domestic service and the military. This demand for labor, coupled with the prohibition on enslaving fellow Muslims, led Arab traders to seek slaves from non-Muslim regions, primarily sub-Saharan Africa. The initial stages of the Arab slave trade were characterized by relatively small-scale operations. Arab merchants would venture into sub-Saharan Africa, establishing trading posts and forging alliances with local rulers. These alliances often involved the exchange of goods such as textiles, beads and weapons for slaves. However, as the demand for slaves grew, so too did the scale and brutality of the trade. The Arab slave trade differed from the transatlantic slave trade in several significant ways. Firstly, the Arab slave trade, although partially motivated by a preconceived notion of religious and cultural superiority, it was not solely driven by racial prejudice. While racist ideologies certainly existed and still exist within Arab societies, the primary motivation for the enslavement of Africans by Arabs stemmed from economic and social incentives. Slaves were seen as a valuable commodity and a source of labor, regardless of their skin color. The East African slave trade, a significant branch of the broader Arab slave trade, focused on the coastal regions of East Africa, particularly present-day Kenya, Tanzania and Mozambique. This region, known to Arab geographers as the Zanj, became a major source of slaves for the Arab world. The Zanj people, primarily Bantu-speaking agriculturalists, were highly sought after for their skills in farming, fishing and domestic labor. Arab traders, sailing in their distinctive dhows, established trading posts along the East African coast, some of which evolved into thriving city-states such as Kilwa, Mombasa and Zanzibar. These coastal cities became hubs for the slave trade, connecting the interior regions of East Africa to markets across the Indian Ocean. Slaves captured or traded from the interior were transported to these coastal cities, where they were held in barracoons, awaiting shipment to destinations such as Arabia, Persia and India. The conditions faced by slaves during their journey to the coast were often brutal. Forced to march hundreds of miles, often shackled together, many succumbed to disease, starvation or exhaustion. Those who survived the arduous journey faced the horrors of the Middle Passage, the perilous voyage across the Indian Ocean. Packed tightly into the holds of dhows, slaves endured deplorable conditions with limited access to food, water and sanitation. The East African slave trade had a profound impact on the demographics and social structures of the region. The constant demand for slaves fueled intertribal conflicts and instability as local rulers raided neighboring communities for captives to trade. This led to a decline in population in some areas and the disruption of traditional social and economic systems. This significantly hampered the growth of industries, innovation, and economic development of the African continent. While the East African slave trade flourished along the coast, another major artery of the Arab slave trade cut across the heart of the continent, the Trans-Saharan trade route. This route connected the North African coast, controlled by various Arab dynasties, to the sub-Saharan regions south of the Sahara Desert. The Trans-Saharan slave trade predated the large-scale transatlantic slave trade and played a significant role in shaping the social, economic and political landscapes of both North and West Africa. The harsh conditions of the Sahara Desert made for a perilous journey. Camels, known as the ships of the desert, were the primary mode of transport, carrying goods, people and, tragically, enslaved Africans. These caravans, often comprising hundreds of camels and individuals, would embark on the arduous journey across the scorching sands, facing the constant threats of dehydration, sandstorms and bandit raids. Oases scattered across the vast expanse of the Sahara served as vital stopping points for the caravans. Cities like Timbuktu, Gao and Sijil Massa flourished as trading centres, connecting the North African coast to the kingdoms and empires of West Africa, such as Ghana, Mali and Songhai. These kingdoms, often engaged in conflicts with one another, provided a steady supply of captives for the slave trade. The spread of Islam was also intricately linked to the trans-Saharan trade routes. The Arab slave trade, like any economic system, operated on the principles of supply and demand. The insatiable demand for slaves in the Arab world fueled the capture and trade of millions of Africans. This demand stemmed from various factors, particularly the expansion and development of plantation agriculture and the use of slaves in domestic services and military service in an era when conquest was rife. In the early centuries, the demand for slaves was primarily driven by the need for soldiers and labourers. As Arab empires expanded, they required large and disciplined armies to maintain their borders and to quell internal rebellions. Slaves, often captured during conquests or purchased from slave traders, were trained as soldiers and formed elite military units. These slave soldiers, known as Mamluks, played a significant role in the political and military history of the Islamic world. The development of plantation agriculture in the Arab world, particularly the cultivation of sugarcane, dates and cotton, further fueled the demand for slaves. These labour-intensive crops required a large and readily available workforce, and slaves were seen as an ideal solution. Plantations, often located in fertile river valleys or coastal plains, relied heavily on slave labour, and the profits generated from these enterprises contributed significantly to the wealth of Arab elites and powerful dynasties. The domestic sphere also played a significant role in driving the demand for slaves. Wealthy Arab households often had large numbers of slaves to perform various tasks, such as cooking, cleaning, childcare, and entertaining guests. Slaves were seen as a status symbol and a sign of one's wealth and prestige. Female slaves in particular were highly sought after for their beauty and domestic skills. For Africans swept into the Arab slave trade, life became a harsh and uncertain existence, stripped of their freedom and dignity. The experiences of enslaved Africans varied greatly, depending on their destination, the type of labour they were forced to perform, and the temperament of their enslavers. However, a common thread of exploitation, abuse, and the denial of basic human rights ran through their lives. The journey itself, whether across the Sahara Desert or the Indian Ocean, was fraught with peril. Many succumbed to disease, starvation, or exhaustion before reaching their destination. Those who survived faced the disorienting and often terrifying experience of being sold into slavery, separated from their families and communities and thrust into an alien culture and language. Upon arrival, enslaved Africans were often branded or marked as property, stripping them of their identity and human dignity, reducing them to mere commodities and instruments for exploitation. The type of labour they performed varied widely. Some were forced to work on date plantations in present-day Iraq. mine salt in the Sahara Desert, or dive for pearls in the Arabian and Persian Gulf. Others were made to work as domestic slaves, concubines to wealthy Arabs, or used as soldiers for conquests. The treatment of enslaved Africans by Arabs was no less brutal than that by Europeans during the transatlantic slave trade. Enslaved Africans were subject to the whims of their owners and had little recourse against abuse or exploitation. The Arab slave trade wasn't confined to a single path, but rather a complex web of interconnected routes spanning continents. These routes, carved by centuries of trade and human suffering, stretched from the heart of Africa across the Sahara Desert, along the East African coast and into the Middle East, Indian subcontinent, and even parts of Europe. One major artery, the Trans-Saharan trade route, saw caravans laden with enslaved Africans traverse the scorching Sahara, connecting sub-Saharan Africa to North Africa. This route, active centuries before the transatlantic slave trade, facilitated the exchange of not just people, but also goods, ideas, and even religions like Islam, which spread southward alongside the trade. Along the East African coast, a maritime route flourished. Arab dhows, plying the waters of the Indian Ocean, transported enslaved Africans from bustling port cities like Zanzibar, Mombasa, and Kilwa to markets in Arabia, Persia, and India. This route, fueled by the demand for labor on plantations and in households, had a devastating impact on the demographics and social structures of East Africa. These routes didn't operate in isolation. They intersected and overlapped, creating a complex network of human trafficking driven by economic greed and a thirst for exploitable labor. Understanding these routes is crucial in comprehending the vast scale of the Arab slave trade and its impact on the African continent and beyond. The Arab slave trade left an indelible mark on African societies, its consequences echoing through generations. The constant demand for slaves fueled instability and conflict, disrupting the political and social landscapes of many African communities and societies. It also adversely distorted traditional power structures, fueled intertribal warfare, and led to the disintegration of communities. The trade's impact transcended physical enslavement. It instilled a deep sense of insecurity and fear in communities targeted for raids. The ever-present threat of capture and enslavement disrupted social and economic activities, hindering development and fostering mistrust among neighboring groups. The loss of millions of people, particularly young and able-bodied individuals, depleted Africa's human capital, hindering its progress and leaving lasting scars on its social fabric. The trade also facilitated the rise of powerful slave trading rather than development-oriented kingdoms in Africa. These kingdoms, motivated by profit and often armed with weapons acquired through the slave trade, engaged in ruthless campaigns to capture and sell into slavery the continent's fittest and most physically productive human capital. The Arab slave trade, which started in the early 7th century and continued for 13 centuries, decimated the continent and robbed it of its most potent human resources. It also hindered the development of strong, unified states, which meant that the continent was not sophisticated enough to repel European imperialism when it arrived to its shores, at least 7 centuries from when the Arab slave trade began. The legacy of the Arab slave trade continues to influence modern-day Africa. The economic disparities, political instability, and ethnic tensions that plague some regions, the Sudan being one example, can be partly attributed to the long-lasting consequences of this brutal trade. Acknowledging and understanding this historical context is crucial for addressing the challenges facing Africa today. The horrors of the Arab slave trade extended far beyond physical subjugation. The psychological and cultural impact of enslavement left deep wounds on individuals and communities, the scars of which continue to resonate through generations. The forced separation of families, the stripping away of identities, and the constant threat of violence created a legacy of trauma and cultural disruption. Enslaved Africans were often stripped of their names, languages, and customs, forced to assimilate into Arab culture. This process of forced acculturation severed their ties to their heritage and created a sense of cultural alienation. The loss of language, a cornerstone of cultural identity, further exacerbated the sense of isolation and dispossession. The trauma of enslavement, characterized by physical, emotional, and sexual abuse, created a legacy of psychological scars passed down through generations. The constant fear, humiliation, and dehumanization experienced by enslaved Africans left lasting psychological wounds, impacting their sense of self-worth and their ability to form healthy relationships. The Arab slave trade wasn't just about the physical movement of people, it was a deliberate attempt to erase identities and break the human spirits of the enslaved Africans. Recognizing and understanding this cultural and psychological violence is crucial in acknowledging the full spectrum of suffering inflicted by this dark chapter in human history. As the horrors of the transatlantic slave trade became increasingly apparent, a wave of moral outrage swept across Europe and the Americas in the late 18th and 19th centuries. This groundswell of opposition to slavery, fueled by Enlightenment ideals of human rights and equality, gave birth to the abolitionist movements, social and political forces that would forever alter the course of history. At the forefront of this movement in the English-speaking world were individuals like William Wilberforce, a British politician who tirelessly campaigned for the abolition of the slave trade. His impassioned speeches in the British Parliament, exposing the inhumanity of the trade, galvanized public support and eventually led to the passage of the Slave Trade Act of 1807, which abolished the transatlantic slave trade within the British Empire. This British abolition was fiercely enforced by the British Royal Navy, which seized ships carrying slave cargo in high seas, apprehended their crew and freed its slaves. Other slave-trading European nations also outlawed slavery. Spain in 1820, Sweden in 1847, France in 1848, Italy in 1850, the Netherlands in 1863, Portugal in 1869, and Belgium in 1890. The abolitionist movement wasn't confined to Britain. Across the Atlantic, figures like Frederick Douglass, a former slave who became a powerful orator and writer, challenged the institution of slavery in the United States. His eloquent writings and speeches exposed the hypocrisy of a nation founded on principles of liberty while perpetuating the enslavement of millions. The fight against slavery was a long and arduous struggle, marked by setbacks and victories. Abolitionists faced fierce opposition from those who profited from the slave trade and those who clung to racist ideologies that justified the enslavement of Africans. However, the movement's moral clarity, coupled with growing public awareness of slavery's horrors, gradually shifted public opinion and paved the way for legislative action. It was not until 1863 when President Abraham Lincoln issued the Abolition Proclamation, which was affirmed by Congress in 1865, abolishing slavery in the United States. While the transatlantic slave trade faced a more concentrated and organized abolitionist movement, the Arab slave trade declined gradually due to a combination of factors, including changing economic conditions and external influences. One significant factor was the decline of plantation agriculture in some parts of the Arab world. As the profitability of certain crops, such as sugarcane, declined, so too did the demand for slave labor. Furthermore, the rise of industrialization in Europe created new economic opportunities, shifting global trade patterns and reducing the economic viability of the slave trade in some regions. Slavery was never abolished in the Arab world, which was under Ottoman rule for most of the period during the abolition in Europe and the United States, until 1918 when the empire collapsed following defeat in the Second World War. Although the trade in slaves from Africa to the Arab world ended when the Europeans partitioned and colonized the continent in the 1800s, slavery in the Arab world was not abolished until in the 20th century. External pressures, particularly from European powers who had abolished slavery in their own territories, also played a role in accelerating abolition in the Arab world. Despite its scale and lasting impact, the Arab slave trade often remains shrouded in a veil of silence, overshadowed by the transatlantic slave trade in historical narratives and public consciousness. This reality justifies why confronting this legacy of silence is essential. Our exploration of the Arab slave trade, a chapter often relegated to the shadows of history, has unearthed a narrative both disturbing and illuminating. We've journeyed through centuries, witnessing the ebb and flow of trade routes, and most importantly, the resilience and suffering of millions of Africans ensnared in this brutal trade in human beings. This isn't merely an exercise in historical excavation. It's about understanding how the echoes of this trade reverberate in the present, shaping the social, economic and political landscapes of the African continent. From the bustling slave markets of Zanzibar to the unforgiving expanse of the Sahara Desert, the Arab slave trade left an indelible mark on the African continent. It reshaped demographics, fueled conflicts, and left a legacy of trauma that continues to haunt communities across generations. By bringing this history to light, we begin to grasp the deeply rooted complexities of modern-day Africa, the lingering economic disparities, the political instability, and the social divisions that find their roots in this era of exploitation. Yet, acknowledging this painful past isn't about assigning blame or perpetuating a cycle of victimhood. It's about understanding the forces that shaped history, recognizing the interconnectedness of human history, and using this knowledge to build a more just and equitable future. By confronting the uncomfortable truths of the Arab slave trade, we equip ourselves to challenge the mindset of oppression and inequality that still persists today, remnants of a past we can no longer afford to ignore. The Arab slave trade, like the transatlantic slave trade, stands as a stark reminder of humanity's capacity for cruelty and greed. It's tempting, perhaps even instinctive, to quantify suffering, to compare and contrast the horrors endured by enslaved populations in different times and places. However, such comparisons, while sometimes academically relevant, often miss the larger point. Slavery in all its forms represent a profound betrayal of mankind's shared humanity. Each system, fueled by its own set of economic imperatives, social structures and racist ideologies and preconceived notions, inflicted unimaginable suffering upon hundreds of millions. Whether shackled in the hold of a ship bound for the Americas, the Arab world and India, or forced to traverse the Sahara Desert under the scorching sun, enslaved Africans endured unimaginable horrors: the loss of freedom, the separation from loved ones, the brutal denial of their basic human dignity. As we conclude our exploration of the Arab slave trade, we must remember that history isn't merely a collection of facts and dates confined to textbooks. It's a living narrative that shapes our present and informs our future. The lessons gleaned from this dark chapter in human history, however uncomfortable, offer valuable insights into the dangers of greed, the corrosive nature of prejudice, and the importance of safeguarding human dignity. The Arab slave trade, like all forms of slavery, it serves as a stark reminder of what happens when societies prioritize profit over people, when difference is weaponized to justify oppression, and when silence allows injustice to flourish. Yet amidst the darkness, there's hope. By acknowledging the past, engaging in open dialogue, and actively dismantling the remnants of these exploitative systems, we can forge a path towards a more just and equitable world, a world where the horrors of slavery are never repeated, and where every individual is afforded the dignity and respect they deserve. This isn't simply a moral imperative, it's a shared responsibility. It requires a collective commitment to education, to amplifying marginalized voices, and to challenging systems of oppression wherever they exist. By working together across cultures and continents, we can honor the memory of those who suffered under the yoke of such industrial-scale slavery. If you found this exploration insightful, please support our channel by subscribing, liking the video, and sharing it with others. Your engagement helps us continue to bring important stories to light and foster a more informed and compassionate world. Thank you for watching.